Ever since getting a Fitbit, it's been really fun to see how many steps I take while preaching. I write so that you will know how one ought to conduct oneself in the church. Continuing looking at the word godliness in Paul's letter to Timothy, we come to chapter 5, and we see more instruction. And maybe it's surprising to you. Maybe it'll be a bit shocking. Maybe it'll be wildly interesting. But the two things I want to do this morning is to help us understand Paul's meaning that true widows need to be honored, and what it means to practice godliness to your own household. So those are my two goals, and I've structured the lesson to sort of follow those two questions, those two focus points. What does it mean to honor widows indeed, and what does it mean to practice godliness to our own household? Godliness is defined as proper piety, having good piety. Good worship literally is the word, but it really means to have correct religious behavior, to express the Christian religion in our actions. It's the proper behavior of a Christian, and it's living in a way that pleases Christ. Godliness, it defines everything really about our religion and what we are to know and who we are to be. Well, the first point then is about honoring widows. And I'd like you to give attention to the scripture. I'm going to read a bit of text that's a little lengthy, but we'll revisit the verses that are especially relevant as we continue along. Paul writes, "Honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety." That is the term godliness. It's not translated godliness right now because godliness is a noun and it's being used in the infinitive form, which is the dictionary form. So you look up words in the dictionary: to work, to play, to godliness. Well, that doesn't work. So they insert the word practice to help translate this form of the word. But I'm telling you, it's the same term that we've been studying in this letter, godliness. So they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now, she who is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God, and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead, even while she lives. Prescribe these things, Timothy, as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse younger widows, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation, because they have set aside their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle, as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. For some have already turned aside to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it, the church, may assist those who are widows indeed. Recognize, please, that this text is not dealing with every circumstance that happens in life with regard to a widow. And realize that the condemnation for, having a desire to get married, he's not condemning widows to remarry. He's condemning a certain attitude in a certain situation with widows that have made certain promises. And did you notice all the qualities and characteristics that are of evil that are also attributed to these women? So we're not going to take this and just apply it to every widow ever, right? So we want to first understand honoring widows indeed. And it's not necessarily even how, I'm even saying that maybe in a way that's confusing. Honor widows who are widows indeed, who are truly widows, right? Okay. Honor can mean to praise, to lift up, or greatly respect. We show honor to God in our worship. Men honor their wives, and wives honor their husbands. Verse 9 says something about putting them on a list. And then a few verses later it says, refuse others and don't put them on the list. So he's describing a kind of woman in this case who is truly a widow. And he defines that for us, doesn't he? He says that these women are all alone in the world. So a widow indeed is, verse 9, to be put on the list. And not only that, but these widows indeed, who are truly widows, who are truly left all to themselves, and all they have to ask, all they have to rely on is God. And they do so night and day. Widow indeed, who is truly, truly alone, the church is called on to assist, to honor. Honor widows who are widows indeed. Does that mean we don't honor widows in general? No, we're going to honor them. We're going to lift them up. We're going to, highly respect them. So he's talking about something very, very particular. We're going to give honor to widows who are truly widows. And again, it's not to the dishonoring or ignoring of others completely. So this word honor carries with it the connotation of the context, which is the honor then means that we will assist them. We will assist them. We will give them the help that they need. In one way or another, we're going to care for them. It's similar to what I read in James chapter 1, verse 27, that pure and undefiled religion is that we visit widows and orphans in their time of need. Visit, in that context, and just like the word assist in this context, is not just about going and checking on them. You got a pulse? Okay, good. I was here for 5 minutes. Now I can go. I fulfilled my duty of visiting you. Visit in James means to provide for. You're there to check on and see what their needs are. It's not just to keep them company, although that's important. To give them fellowship, yes, that's vital. But the pure and undefiled religion, what does an orphan need? Does he need you to come by and say hello? Or does he need some assistance? What does a widow need? Assistance. Someone to care for. And so that's what Paul is describing in this chapter about godliness. I quoted for you chapter 3, verse 15. I'm writing to you so that you'll know how one should conduct themselves in the household of God. You're going to come into God's house. You're going to abide by God's rules. And so he's teaching us how we can practice piety in a very unique way, in a very unique situation, regarding women in particular in this context, in the church, who are left all alone. We are to put them on the list. And there's qualifications, right? He says, put them on the list if they're older than 60. I mean, there's practical things that we could talk about, but it's beyond the scope of this lesson. Really, I want to get to the point 2, which is about really where it affects us in our life. In fact, I kind of want to ask Ainsley and Ezra and Mitchell to come sit right here, so I can teach them about what practicing piety to their good old dad one day. But if I ask them to do that, then I better have a mirror, because I've got a mom in Oklahoma who's aging. Am I taking care of her? Am I practicing piety toward my mom? I'm writing so you'll know how to conduct yourself in the household of God. I did some research this week on, I was kind of curious. What does the world do with their aging parents? What do people that have never read this and they're not instructed by, and they don't view this as a standard that would command them in their behavior? And, just asking the internet, I'm not going to get anything definitive, but there are statistics. There has been research that's done. And I was pleasantly surprised, let's just say, to find that a good portion of the internet, the research I'm seeing, says that people are taking care of their aging parents. There are certain areas where the church sort of keeps up with the world. And we've talked about pornography and how the church is not doing any better than the world with regard to pornography. This is an area, just like pornography, where the church ought to be way far ahead, right? We ought to be way far ahead of the world when it comes to practicing piety towards members of our own household. I was reading things online that basically said, like, well, my dad made me mad, so I just, took him out of my life. Or I'll give him a chance, but the moment he gives me any trouble, he's getting sent off somewhere. Or, this generation is going to learn real soon, the results of being abusive towards us kids. And just all excuse after excuse. It's hard. You can't expect to every day be taking care of your aging parents. And so there's a large voice in the world that wants to excuse this, that does want to pass the responsibility off, out of sight, out of mind. But the church needs to listen to that which is adjacent to the text that says, this is pleasing in the sight of God. And so if there were a case among our congregation, I'm proud to say that we've helped families in the past. We've helped individuals when they've had needs. I believe that we are a congregation that assists. But if we had a widow indeed among us, that we truly would step up and take on the burden of caring for a widow indeed. A widow actually, right? And so the implication then about honoring widows in this passage about widows indeed is that, number one, the church should bear the burden of assisting those who are left all alone in the world. Number two, that we're going to teach these principles and practice them, verse 7, as Timothy was charged to do. And number three, that these are to be put on a list and maybe we don't understand the full implications or the full knowledge of what Timothy was to do with a list, but there needed to be something where the church is, in an official way, going to care for these widows indeed. And then number 4, we're going to understand the implication that God's house law demands it, that godliness and piety is to be practiced by the church. There's more in this context about the widows who are not widows indeed. If they're young enough, let them remarry. Let them be above reproach. There's a great deal said about turning away from Christ and going after Satan, as some apparently already have. And so Timothy prescribed, teach these things so that they will be above reproach. The they, in context, I think it points 2 ways. I think it's appropriate to say that it points to the widows, so that the widows will be above reproach in their behavior. But I think it also points to those of the household that have the means that can practice piety, to be above reproach, so that you don't become someone that's worse than an unbeliever. Okay, looking now at practicing godliness to our own households. So contextually, I want to deal with verses 4 and verses 8 in particular. These are helping to show God's will. These are helping to show God's will, and that widows with family should not become the responsibility of the church solely. Paul doesn't want the church unnecessarily burdened by taking care of widows who have the means to support themselves, even if it's through living family. But again, I want us to be able to look inward on ourselves. We might joke with our aging parents about sending them off to some nursing home, but we shouldn't joke that way, because that actually happens. And we shouldn't joke, we shouldn't threaten, we should instead have this attitude that we first learn, he says, first learn, and that's in the imperative, so it's this command that Timothy is being given from Paul, to first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family. And as you keep reading the next phrase is going to specifically give us what practicing piety means. First and foremost, it means to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. So to practice proper Christian behavior, to have the right information, the truth about what pleases God, to have the facts of this commandment now placed in your lap. You've heard it at least today, if you've never heard it before, that this is what God expects to happen in his house. That you make a return for your parents. To give back. You go to the library, you check out books, you take it back. There's nothing like difficult about this word. You make a return. You were cared for. You were cared for. Every need of yours was taken care of. And so the return that we will be giving to our aging parents is that we will assist. We will take care of their needs. And that is godliness. It describes, if someone could see that happening, and I see it happening among us. Maybe I shouldn't mention names because I don't want to give unnecessary attention, or maybe if I leave somebody out, but there are families among this congregation who are doing this very thing. They're making a return. They're practicing piety. And so when you look at that life, it's just, the glory of that is, this is godliness. This is what pleases God. It's almost like the sacrifices of the Old Testament that literally God would smell through his nostrils that hopefully weren't as clogged as mine, and he would say, that's a pleasing aroma. And so when families make this return of godliness, it's rising up to God, and that's what a Christian, that is embracing, and that is embodying what I want in my children down on earth. One scholar wrote this: grown children, grandchildren should delight in making all the return they can. Yet it has been well said that one father is able to keep and provide for 10 children, while 10 children often cannot see their way clear to take care of one old father. And the statistics seem to bear that out. And the statistics show that if I look at my family, I've got a brother and I've got a sister, the statistics would show that my sister would be the one who would take on the responsibility more frequently than the boys, than the sons. Why is it? I don't know, but is it the motherly care that God put into women? And so my sister, I mean, my mom chose to move to Oklahoma to be near my sister. Maybe she was already thinking ahead, like, man, I don't know. So again, right, like, this is hitting my toes too. Clayton, you need to practice piety toward your mom. Clayton, you need to make sure that as she ages and she can't care for herself, then I need to. And Rhiannon and I, we've talked. It's like, we can't probably, pay for a whole lot of things, but Mom, you can move in and we'll make a spot for you in our house. We need to be willing to sacrifice to that extent. I mean, when you had a baby, your whole world changed. And I think it's fair and right to have this attitude that we need to care for our parents or our grandparents. And I don't want to put any limitations on this, you see, because well, yeah, but what about if this happens? Or what about if they need this? Or what if they need that? See, Paul doesn't get into the details, does he? But what he says is that it is the will of God that we first learn to practice piety towards, what does it actually say? Regard to your own family, which literally is the idea of house, and to make some return to their parents. And so I don't want to give you specifics, because then that's going to train you to think in the way that Clayton thinks. Oh, well, I'm going to practice piety. I'm going to sacrifice to this point. But Clayton said if it goes beyond that, that it's okay to send them off somewhere else. That I can excuse myself after what Clayton said. I'm not the standard. I don't know what you can and can't do. I don't know what kind of care your grandparent or your parent is going to need. But I do know this, because I know myself, and I'm learning something of human nature in general, that I think we would be prone to excuse ourselves sooner than we should. I think we're more prone to, you hear what I'm saying? To justify, to excuse a hiring out, maybe before we should. And that's really all I want to say about that, is to think about that. Think about the level of sacrifice. Think about what practicing piety to your own family would look like. And now verse 8, which, verse 4 really ought to have enough authority behind it. It really have enough bite behind it. But so many times I'm always like, I wish that the writer would have given us more. And in this case, he gives us more, and it's kind of scary. Verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Ouch. Denied the faith. Not his personal faith. I mean, that probably happens too, but this is saying essentially that the faith is what Paul is telling Timothy to teach. Prescribe and teach these commandments. And if you don't do that, you're saying no to the faith. You're denying it. It's like God's house has this beautiful door, and you come in, and there's the house law, and it says, take off your shoes. And you say, absolutely not. I'm not taking off my shoes. I'm going to come in here anyway. You deny the faith. You say no to. And it's probably a lot stronger than that. But then he says you're worse than an unbeliever. You're worse than someone that never believed, that never professed to believe. Why? Well, is it because many unbelievers know how to get this done? Is it because the world around us, when you look at the statistics, that 40% of them are taking care of their families, and then another 30% are maybe they can't personally take care of it, but they're financially doing it, or whatever percent you might find out there? Is it because that even the Gentiles know how to do this? Is that sort of the idea here? Is it that it brings shame on the church? It brings shame on God's people, that people blaspheme because when they look at this situation, Christians, what did you say, brother, in your prayer? That we don't cast aside the elderly? And that if that's what we're doing because we're not providing for our own, we're not providing for those of our own house, casting them aside is unwanted or too burden of a bear, too big of a burden to bear. Or could it be as bad as it is for an unbeliever to not care for his own household, that it's not as bad as someone who has the true teaching and then deny it by saying, no, I'm not going to do that? Is that why you're worse than an unbeliever? Because you have the truth. You know the expectation. And you're sticking your lower jaw out. The bite of verse 8 is deep. This verse, I think, should have, and I hope it has had for a long time, the effect of warning and preventing much sin in the household of God. So again, I'll say, I imagine that you might be wondering what this specifically looks like in your unique situation. Well, right now, what it looks like for me is that, Rhea and I, we're with my siblings, we're paying money now to save up for our mom's future needs. We're doing a little bit of that each month. That's what that looks like right now in my life. But as the years go by and as mom gets older and older, that's going to look differently. It can't just be that I contribute financially. It has to, for me, it has to be more than that. Let this text speak to you. Let this text tell you if what you're doing now is sin, or let this text teach you so that you understand what needs to be done in the future. Do you have aging grandparents? Are their needs met? Do you have aging great-grandparents, and are they taken care of? Are their lives adequate? I'm not judging. I'm not judging any decision. I'm not judging assisted living. I'm not judging palliative care. I'm not judging any needs like that. I'm simply saying this is what Paul said to the church. He said it to Timothy, to the church in Ephesus. And that this still has authority today. And so we want to be like all ears, right? When it comes to godliness, when it comes to what we believe, our doctrine, what we teach, and what we do. And so with no motives, let's wrestle through this together. Quite honestly, I'm saying this. If you're in a situation where you're not sure, maybe your dad needs some kind of medical care, and so you're torn up on how much can you provide for that. Let's have conversations with each other. This is a part of what the church is for. So wrestle through this, and let's, Karsten, I think what you spoke about the songs, I think that was very similar to what ancient preaching was. Simply just the exhortation, right? These more simple things that this is what we're told to do. Let's go do it. And so let's not shy away from those difficult conversations. I mean, if someone came to you and said, "Man, I've got this aging parent, and I want to honor God. I want to do what's right. I want to do what's pleasing. But this is the situation. Can you help me think through this? Am I doing right? Do I need to do more?" Let's use each other in that sense. And ultimately, where's the commandment here? Honor widows who are widows indeed as a church collectively. And then for any other where you have family present, the children are commanded to learn to practice piety and to make a return, to care for the aging people in our family. To do otherwise calls into question our attitude toward our God. He has always prescribed people to take care of the helpless. The orphans and the widows have always had a special place in the mind and heart of God. And he has always expected his people to rise and meet the need. Let's be people who can agree with this. Let's be people who get our lives in line with this, realizing what the will of God about this topic is. We have one more lesson in 1 Timothy about godliness, and it's in chapter 6. We're going to see godliness used a couple times. And after that, we'll move on to a different study. But this has really just been a beautiful thing to see in a very simple way. Paul wrote this letter so that the church in Ephesus would know how a Christian needs to conduct themselves. A hard heart is one that, when it hears the truth presented, like maybe somebody here today, but the truth can't penetrate into that heart. And ultimately, it's that hard heart that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It's that hard heart that destroyed the temple twice in Jerusalem, and the people went off to captivity. You might say, oh, it was their disobedience. Well, yeah, but it's that they also didn't repent. And so ultimately, God had to send Assyria, send Babylon. He's not sending anything to us to soften our hearts that he hasn't already sent. We're supposed to look back and read about the lives of other people. How did that work out for them? And humble our hearts. So let's be people, whether it's about this teaching about widows or taking care of our aging parents or any other teaching, whether it comes from my mouth, Ben's mouth, Karsten, any of our teachers in this congregation, that we have a soft and humble heart that will listen and transform. Let's offer our invitation now. It's an invitation for someone that needs to become a Christian. Maybe there's somebody here who's not yet been baptized into Christ. It's an invitation for restoration, for repentance and healing. It's an invitation for any need you have, for us to pray for you and help you. Any need that's there at all, please come down to the front while Karsten leads us in another beautiful song.